The shir is on Likutei Sichos Chelek Yud Zayin, book 17, Bechukosai, the first sicher. The beginning of our parsha, Rashi quotes from the pasuk that says, "In Bechukosai Teilechu," which literally one would just translate, "If you go in my statutes." That would be the way one would translate without seeing Rashi. And Rashi's mafarish, what does that mean? Yochels, I would think maybe this means literally Chukosai, go in and keep my statutes, my mitzvahs. However, right after that it says, and you will keep my mitzvahs. So obviously, the second part of the sentence is directly referring to mitzvahs. So what are we going to do with the word in says Rashi? That you should be toiling. You should toil in Torah. Work hard. Exert yourself in Torah. The source for Rashi's explanation is in the Sefer Torah's Koyanim, right? Basically, a compilation of Medrash on the Book of Vayikra. However, since Rashi brings, Rashi is as he has stated, his objective is to bring the simple meaning of the pasuk. And Rashi only brings from Midrashim, from the expounding of our sages, only when it's relevant and it's imperative in order to explain the simple meaning of the pasuk. So therefore we have to say that this interpretation of the Torah's Kohanim, which Rashi brings to explain the Bechukosai, it doesn't mean keeping the mitzvahs, rather it means toiling. In Torah, it is necessary to the simple reading of the pasuk. This way we'll also understand why Rashi brings the entire thought process. He says, you may think that words Bechukosai mean like you would think instinctively. It means keeping the mitzvahs. So when the pasuk later continues in the next very words, says, and you keep my mitzvahs, so obviously that's mitzvahs, it says mitzvahs. So what's Bechukosai Teilecho? It means toiling in Torah. He doesn't just come and translate Bechukosai Teilecho as being persevering, toiling in Torah. Because if he did that, you would think perhaps that he's translating the actual meaning of the words to be in their simple in their simple translation, somehow meaning toiling in Torah. He's not saying that. He's saying that usually you would be correct in thinking would mean going in the path of the mitzvahs. However, in this case, says Rashi, we can't learn that that's the simple meaning because the pasuk immediately follows that up with saying, and if you keep my mitzvahs, well, that's mitzvahs, obviously. So what does it mean, going in the chukim? Obviously, it means something else. And therefore, he brings the interpretation of the sages, which means that the actual simple meaning of the verse needs to mean something else than mitzvahs. It means here toiling in Torah. However, what's not understood, the Rabbi asks as follows. First of all, Rashi says here that Bechukosai, all he's really trying to explain is that Bechukosai doesn't mean mitzvahs as you would usually mean statutes, but it means Torah. So he should have just quoted from the words he should have quoted as the heading of the Rashi should be in Bechukosai, and just translate what Bechukosai means. Why does he bring the whole heading in Bechukosai Teilechu? If you go in my chukim. Question number 2. The question becomes even stronger because in the Torah's Kohanim, which is the source that we're quoting as the source of Rashi, it does say, you see, let's see what Rashi says. Rashi says, I may think this means kiyum. When it says Bechukosai Teilechu, I may think this means kiyum ha-mitzvahs, the fulfillment of the mitzvahs. It says no. When it says the continuation of the pasuk, that's already the fulfillment of the mitzvahs. That whole word about fulfillment of mitzvahs, kiyum mitzvahs, about actually performing mitzvahs. Why does Rashi even bring that? It could have just, all he's trying to do is to interpret the word Bechukosai not as meaning mitzvahs, as you would think, but it meaning Torah. So just focus on the word Bechukosai. Don't focus on mitzvahs. Don't focus on kiyum mitzvahs, on the words of fulfilling mitzvahs. That's question number 2. So, focus just on chukim, on the word Chukosai. Now, question number 3, based on what we've asked, obviously Rashi is also explaining, answering a second question you may have, that we Rashi is saying that, sorry, just one second, Gimel, Muzman Zogn. So we have to say, as Rashi warnt, ich hat zweite Sach in Kiyum HaMitzvahs. Rashi is saying that there's something else. A second thing Rashi is forewarning. Rashi is letting us know what is. In Kiyum HaMitzvahs, that somehow the pasuk Bechukosai telechu means not just study Torah, but it means exert yourself in Torah, toil in Torah. Where do we get to that? From the fact that, okay, we understand that Bechukosai telechu can't mean doing mitzvahs, right? Because the pasuk continues right in the same breath. If you do my chukim, and then it says, and you keep my mitzvahs. So obviously that's already talking about mitzvahs. So Bechukosai we interpret as Torah, but how do we know it means exerting in Torah? That's the third question. Fourth question is on the words Ves mitzvosai tishmei. Rashi says you should toil in Torah in order to fulfill the mitzvahs. Now, Rashi said just now that the words Ves mitzvosai tishmei mean the fulfillment of the mitzvahs. Now Rashi is saying that the words Ves mitzvosai tishmei means studying Torah in order to fulfill the mitzvahs. Hello, like why doesn't it just mean the fulfillment of the mitzvahs? Why does Rashi now give an interpretation that the toiling in Torah needs to be in order to do the mitzvahs? What does it just mean? Toil in Torah, and then part 2, do mitzvahs. So chapter 2 here, the Rebbe says the explanation that this is following. When it says do the mitzvahs, here's the issue. Talmud Torah, learning Torah, is one of the 613 mitzvahs. And every little child knows that because he gets up in the morning and he says, blessed are you, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed is Hashem, who gave us the mitzvah of learning Torah, of studying Torah. So according to this is understood why we can't say Bechukosai telechu means just regular learning Torah, because regular learning Torah is included in the next words of the pasuk, and keep my mitzvahs. So again, the question would be, if Bechukosai telechu means studying Torah, but one second, but that's already included in the next part of the sentence, which is keep the mitzvahs. So learning Torah is also a mitzvah. So from this, Rashi finds it imperative to say that there must be something additional in these words when you go in my chukim, as it refers to Torah, not just the mitzvah of learning Torah. There's another detail in the learning of Torah. You wouldn't know it from the pasuk, keep my mitzvahs, because learning Torah is a mitzvah, but there's something else even more intense about fulfilling the mitzvah of learning Torah, which would be expressed in the word telechu, go in the study of Torah. It's not included in just the words keep my mitzvah. How can you add in learning Torah? Which that addition, in other words, we have to find something like this. We have to find a way where we can have an added emphasis in learning Torah, but something that even without that added emphasis, the fulfillment of the mitzvah would have been complete, because the Torah says, if you fulfill my mitzvahs, and we go ahead and say that's why Bechukosai telechu can't mean just doing the mitzvah, but learning Torah is a mitzvah. No, Bechukosai telechu means doing more than the mitzvah of learning Torah. How could you do more than the mitzvah of learning Torah by learning Torah? So he says like this: if in quantity, well, quantity adding more learning Torah is still the same learning Torah. It's just more learning Torah, right? Imagine if somebody puts on tefillin, says Rebbe. Is there a difference how long he wears the tefillin? It's the same mitzvah of putting on tefillin, so long as it's on his hand and as long as it's on his arm, it's on his arm. Short time, long time. When somebody's learning Torah, it's the same learning Torah if he's learning short, long. It's not a fundamental change or an addition in the actual quality of the learning. So we have to say that when the pasuk underlines and emphasizes, if you go in my chukim, it's not just keeping the mitzvah of learning Torah. There's an additional qualitative upgrade in the fulfillment of learning Torah. What kind of an upgrade? Toiling in Torah. That's not included in the simple mitzvah of keep my mitzvahs, the mitzvah of learning Torah. Because you can also fulfill the mitzvah of learning Torah even if you haven't exerted yourself to the utmost. You're still learning Torah. So this is an addition to the fulfillment of all the mitzvahs. Part of those mitzvahs is learning Torah. In addition to that, the pasuk says, if you go in my statutes, aka, in other words, here, i.e., if you toil, if you add something qualitative to your fulfillment of the mitzvah of Torah, which is toiling in Torah, that's what's referred to as im bechukosai telechu. 3, Gimel. According to this, however, we're going to have to understand, one second, what about the order of the pasuk? Since the pasuk is saying two components, toiling in Torah and keeping all the mitzvahs, what should come first? First should come keeping the mitzvahs. First should be, if you keep my mitzvahs, which includes Torah in its standard way of learning Torah, just learning lemigras, learning in a way of, I won't say superficial. I'm saying, in a more general way. So that should have said that first. If you fill my mitzvahs, and then it should have said, and you upgrade your Torah to be toiling in Torah. And that's actually the way we learn in general. First of all, you get the general gist. You learn the thing in more of a general way, not so in depth, and then you delve in depth. You toil into the concept. You can't start right away learning things in great depth before you first have some kind of a quantity of learning. You need to have some kind of a breadth of knowledge in order to start getting into real great depth, right? So why does the pasuk first speak about the toil, the exertion, and then go into the regular fulfillment of the mitzvah? So we would say, well, maybe the reverse. Maybe going in my chukim is general study Torah, and maybe mitzvah tishmeru means mitzvahs. If we could say that, then that would make sense. We would understand. First, it says learn Torah before keeping mitzvahs, because in order to keep mitzvahs, you got to know what to do. As we understand, you want to know what to do in fulfillment of mitzvahs, you got to study. So you would say that it means learn Torah and do mitzvahs. But once we have translated this b'chokesei telech to mean to exert in Torah, so you're not going to be able to answer like that, because you can do mitzvahs without learning Torah in great depth. Yeah. In order to know what to do, you don't need to toil and learn it at a great depth. So we're left with the question, why does it say first b'chokesei telecha? Why does it emphasize toil in Torah before it speaks about the general keeping of the mitzvahs? So from this itself, Rashi has a proof that this is a detail in the learning of Torah. In other words, when it says, if you are toiling in Torah and keeping the mitzvahs, it's not talking about mitzvahs per se as fulfilling the mitzvahs, because otherwise the mitzvahs should have been mentioned before the study of Torah. Here we're talking about a detail within the emphasis of exertion of Torah. There's another nuance, there's another caveat. That is, you have to exert yourself in Torah with the intention of fulfilling the mitzvahs. So the flow of the pasuk is, if you study and toil in Torah, and you do so with the intention of fulfilling the mitzvahs. And this is where Rashi brings the pasuk that he brings, as it says, you shall learn them and you shall keep them. In other words, learning Torah at any level, even at the greatest depth, always has to be anchored and with the intention of fulfillment of mitzvahs. According to this, we can understand why it says first, Rashi says, you should toil in Torah. With regard to fulfilling the mitzvahs, it's no stira, it's no contradiction to the fact that it says first. Rashi first says the mitzvahs tishmeru means fulfilling the mitzvahs. First, Rashi wants to establish that this can't be talking just simply about it cannot be talking about mitzvahs, because the pasuk goes on to say, and keep my mitzvahs. So obviously it doesn't mean mitzvahs. So Rashi has used that as a first step, as a first prong to explain, must be talking about Torah. What kind of Torah? Toil in Torah. 1 second, toil in Torah. So why does that just say fulfill the mitzvahs after the learning? Because we're talking about toiling in Torah for the intention of fulfillment of mitzvahs. Dalit. We need, however, to understand from the fact that Rashi says, from the expression of Rashi that says, I may think that this is a fulfillment of the mitzvahs. From that is imperative that I would think fulfilling the chukim is doing the mitzvahs. However, because the pasuk continues, it says, "You should keep my mitzvahs." That's why we know it means you should toil in Torah. So it's not understood. We know that there's several kinds of mitzvahs. There's mitzvahs that are called testimonials. There's mitzvahs that are called chukim. There are statutes. There are mitzvahs that are called things that we would come to, judgments, things that we would come to from our own sense of internal justice. And the word chukim always means those mitzvahs that are decrees of the king we wouldn't come to on our own. They're statutes. They're supra-rational. They're beyond rationale. As Rashi's already explained this, the end of Parshas Achimais. And if that's the case, so why can't we simply learn that Bechukosai means over here the mitzvahs that are statutes, that are not with intelligible to us rationale. They're higher than intellect, right? Now, mitzvahs simply means the mitzvahs that we understand. Why can't we just say it's talking about two kinds of mitzvahs? So that's a very strong question. Why do we have to go and say the Bechukosai Telecha means toil and Torah? Why don't we just say it means if you keep my mitzvahs that are statutes, that are decrees, and you also keep the mitzvahs that are understandable mitzvahs, then you'll get the rain in the proper time. So we could answer, says the Rebbe, that if this word mitzvosai here means only one kind of mitzvahs, let's say the intelligible mitzvahs, the rational mitzvahs, he wouldn't have used the word mitzvosai. He would have used the word mishpatai. Because we said that they're divided into different categories. In the category of the mitzvahs that are that their reason is fully understood, we call them mishpat. But he says him mitzvahs, so that includes all the mitzvahs. So you can't say here that we're talking about two different kinds of mitzvahs. As we see in the pasuk of where it says, these are the chukim, the mishpatim, and the Torahs, that when he wants to say various different kinds of mitzvahs, he uses the word mishpatim to talk about the mitzvahs that are with a rational explanation, and not the word mitzvah stam. Since here it says the word mitzvosai, so that means from here is a proof we mean all mitzvahs. So that seems to take care of the issue why we can't say that here we're talking about two kinds of mitzvahs, chukim and mishpatim. However, that wouldn't be a good enough answer, says Rebbe, because we do find in a earlier, possibly way earlier, when we're talking about Avraham Avinu, the goodness of Avraham Avinu, Hashem says, Ekev, because Avraham Avinu listened to my voice and he kept my mishmarti, my rules, mitzvosai, my mitzvahs, chukaisai, my statutes, v'toiraisai, and my Torah. And what does Rashi explain there? Mitzvosai, what a mitzvosai, my mitzvahs means? Those are the things that if they wouldn't have been written, they are my commandments. They are the things that even if I wouldn't have written them, they are worthy to be commanded. In other words, they are those things that rationally make so much sense that even if Hashem wouldn't have instructed about them, they needed to be instructed. Mishpatim. And then he says, Chukai, those are the things that the Yetzer Hara and the nations of the world have questions about. They try and refute them. They say, why are you doing that? That doesn't make sense. And indeed, there are mitzvahs that we don't know the reason for. The word v'toiraisai includes, my Torah includes the oral Torah. It says toiraisai, my Torahs. Two aspects of Torah, the written and the oral. So what do we see from that? Even when the pasuk says mitzvahsai, since it also says the word chukim, so therefore mitzvahsai can mean, unlike chukim, the mitzvahs that are rationally explainable. So why can't we learn that here also? In other words, we have a pasuk about Avraham Avinu where we see that mitzvahsai means the rational mitzvahs. Chukaisai means the ones that are beyond rationale. So why can't we learn this way in this pasuk too? The explanation is, says the Rabbi, hey, the word mitzvahsai is from the expression of commandment. It means they're commandments from Hashem. So we understand that terminology is really only applicable to the mitzvahs of after the giving of the Torah. That's when Hashem commanded the mitzvahs. Before Hashem commanded the mitzvahs at Matan Torah, so in that kind of mitzvah, but it says that Avraham Avinu listened to, there wasn't the possibility of this commandment. So when it says, when it calls those mitzvahs mitzvahsai, when it says it by Avraham Avinu, pre-giving of the Torah, before the commandments were actually issued, there it can't mean mitzvahs, the commandments of Hashem, and include everything. Because as we said, weren't yet commandment. So therefore, Rashi learns there that mitzvah means those things that would be fitting, would be appropriate to be commanded, even if they weren't commandment. They would have been appropriate to have been commanded even then before Hashem actually gave commandments, because they just simply make so much sense. That's why they're called mitzvahs. But that terminology, therefore, wouldn't apply after the Torah was given. Mitzvahs would apply to the essence of commandments, which goes on all mitzvahs. Right? In our case, we're talking post-Matan Torah, post the giving of Torah. So therefore, that terminology, the word mitzvahs, commandments, goes on all the mitzvahs. They're all instructions from Hashem. So it'd be very difficult to say that Bechukosai means the ones that are beyond rationale, and mitzvahs just means the ones that are mishpatim. That doesn't fit in the post-Matan Torah, the post-Sinai description of mitzvahs. There, mitzvahs means commandments, anything that was commandment, with a reason, without a reason. So therefore, Rashi goes along with the interpretation of mitzvahs tishmer means all the mitzvahs. If so, what does it mean? Bechukosai telechu. If you keep my chukim, that means exerting in Torah. So that's the way the Rebbe explains the pasuk and the Rashi. Now we move over in Isvav to the Pnimis and to the inside track. Even though Rashi has already proven that Bechukosai telechu means exert yourself in Torah, not from the actual word Bechukosai, but rather because the Torah continues to talk about keeping the mitzvahs, which tells us that Bechukosai can't mean mitzvahs. It needs to be an added dimension of something within Torah, which is exertion in Torah. However, we also have to say that the actual concept of exert yourself in Torah is hinted in the words Bechukosai telechu. Square brackets in the Rebbe says, because Torah is called Torah Or, the Torah that illuminates, a Torah of light. Everything in Torah has to be in an illuminated way, in a way of light. The Torah illuminates everything. And this means that Torah, especially the written Torah, is written in a way that the content of the pasuk has to be illuminated, has to be clear, with clarity. So if this word Bechukosai would have absolutely no connection with toil and Torah, that's not the word that would have been used, right? It would have said Torah or something else, which would have given us the clear intention of the pasuk that it means about learning Torah. So the fact that Hashem chose in the Torah to use the words, if you follow in my chukos, and this refers to toil in Torah, this in itself tells us there must be something intrinsically connected between the word Bechukosai and the concept of toiling in Torah. Zayin, in order to understand how the expression Bechukosai, when it's used in the context of Limud Torah, how it expresses the inyan of omel, of exertion in Torah. So first, we have to explain a detail in the content of what does it mean when we talk about the meaning of the word chukim. Okay, when it's referred to in mitzvahs, chukim. What does chukim mean? We know that besides the word mitzvahs, which is a general word for all the mitzvahs, means commandment, every mitzvah has its individual name. There's edus, which are testimonials. There's mishpatim, which are things that make rational sense. And there's chukim, which are statutes. So edus, the testimonial mitzvahs, those are the kind of mitzvahs that give testimony on certain things. For example, the things that remind us of creation of heaven and earth. Shabbos, for example, remind us that Hashem created the earth in 6 days, right? And the seventh day he rested. Yitzias Mitzrayim. We have Tefillin, remind us about going out of Egypt. And similar things to that, they're testimonials. Once Hashem gives us mitzvahs to remind us about certain things, to attest to certain things. Then we have mishpat of those things that make rational sense. Those are mitzvahs that we say, even if the Torah wouldn't be given, that would be appropriate to conduct ourselves that way. Because we understand that through our own rational understanding, that this is the way a person should conduct himself in a moral and proper way. Then there are chukim. Chukim are things that we don't understand. They're totally just the decree of the king. They don't have any room for us to understand in our logic why to do them. They're not mishpatim. They're not things we would come to in our own rational sense. They're also not testimonials. They are gezerah gozarti, Hashem decreed, v'chukah chakakti, and I've made this law. In Lashon HaKodesh, in Hebrew, the Holy Tongue, which is not just Rebbe says, it's not a Lashon Heskami. Heskami means it's not just everybody agreed. Let's call this chingamajig the thingamajig. This we'll call a thingamajig. What's this connected to thingamajig? Doesn't matter. Everybody decides to call a cup a shmegagi. Then everybody, that cup is shmegagi. That's not the way Lashon Kodesh works. Lashon Kodesh works that every word actually has an intrinsic connection to the thing that it's describing. Everything is exact. Since the mitzvahs that don't have any explanation in our human intellect are called chukim, What's the expression of chukah? We know that chukah, besides being rule and law, chukah actually means carve out. As the Rebbe explains, bring quotes from the Kutei Torah from the Alter Rebbe, in the word Bechukosai, it actually means because it's like carved. So we have to say that there's some kind of a connection in the word carving, which is, and the concept of a mitzvah that's higher than rationale. What's the explanation? It says the Rebbe like this. The general difference between carving and writing is what? That in order to carve something, you need more energy, more force than writing. Writing, you write on the paper. Carving, you actually have to exert force and carve into the thing. So speech is a small deed. With our speech, it creates some waves. There is some action through speech. They say talk is cheap, but it's still more than actions speak louder than words. True, but it's more than thought. Speech is some kind of a deed. However, writing is an entire action, right? But the concept of writing still doesn't require such an exertion, such an investment of strength as engraving does. Engraving requires much more exertion. So from this we can understand that the mitzvahs that are decrees of the king, they're called chukim from the expression of engraving. Because to fulfill something that you don't understand, to fulfill an injunction, an instruction you don't understand, even something that is counterintuitive, runs contrary to your logic, is a much more difficult task. It's a lot more difficult to do something you don't understand. Why in the world you're doing it than to do something that makes perfect sense? You jive with it. So according to this, we can also understand that the expression Bechukosai, when we're using it about Torah, if we're talking about doing something hard, exertion, now we'll understand why the word Chukosai itself tells us that we're doing something that requires exertion. Omel, toiling in Torah. Because that's the meaning of the word chukah. It means supra-rational, higher than rational law. Why is it called that way? What's its connection with engraving? Because you have to work harder to do something that doesn't make sense to you. Similarly, here, once we explain that this is a reference to learning Torah, what kind of learning Torah? Learning Torah with more exertion than you usually do, toiling. A person learns Torah with toiling, with the hard work of what we call chakika, of engraving. So you know what it does? It actually creates a much greater and indelible indentation and engraving in the heart as well. That even if the person's heart is like a heart of stone, if he toils in Torah, so his stony heart becomes engraved and and Torah is impressed upon him through the exertion of Torah. As it says about Rabbi Akiva, it says that avonim shichak umayim, the stones were worn away by the water. If the water keeps dropping long enough, it makes some kind of impression, even on stone. Continues the Rebbe, in Torah everything is exact. So since toiling in Torah is called the expression chukah, chukah means engraving. And that's also the word used for mitzvahs that are higher than intellect. So this in itself is a proof that the reason why exertion in Torah is called chukah is not just because it's more exertion, also because the exertion in Torah has a connection with higher than rationale. What does that mean? Even though we say, generally speaking, learning Torah specifically, the oral Torah has to be in a way that it's understood. If you don't understand what you're learning, so you really can't even make a bracha on the learning of that Torah. If it's written Torah, even if you say it and you don't understand it, you're doing the mitzvah of saying the words of Torah. For example, Tehillim or any of the 24 holy books, the Tanakh. However, when it comes to the oral Torah, it has to be understood. Nonetheless, when a person is toiling in Torah, there's a connection that's made there with higher than rationale. What does that mean? It comes out in two ways. First of all, toiling in Torah has to be, you have to toil more than you naturally or intellectually feel motivated to do, right? Because if you do based on what you feel motivated to do, what intellectually you feel like doing, that's not toil. Toil is doing more than you instinctively or rationally want to do. Number two, toiling in Torah brings you to the understanding that even those things that you do understand, really, they're higher than understanding. When you toil and toil, you realize as much as you understood, there's so much more you don't understand. As it says in the words of the early philosophers of Torah, that the ultimate of knowing Hashem is that we don't know. And that's the ultimate of knowledge. We get to a place where, wow, as much as I know, there's such a vast depth that I still don't know. Similarly, so it is with regards to Hashem. And that's the way it is also with regards to Hashem's Torah, Hashem's wisdom. Hashem and his wisdom are one, as it says in the Rambam. And therefore, the same way, nobody can ever understand Hashem. Nobody can truly grasp the vast depth, plumb the vast depths of Torah. And if a person thinks, if a person thinks he got to the end, got to the total understanding in Torah, it means he hasn't toiled enough. As the previous Rebbe says the Rebbe, that even those things we understand, they're also like things we don't understand. If you get to the depth of them, you understand there's so much more depth, it's like you don't understand. So according to this, we now understand why about learning Torah, the word is used Bechukosai. Even though we're talking about learning Torah, but we're calling it Chukosai, which is a word for saying something super rational, beyond rational. What Torah is rational? No, because even though we're talking about learning things in Torah, not just learning about statutes of Torah, we're talking about even learning things that are rational parts of Torah. But we're talking about learning it to such a depth and with such exertion that they all seems like chukim. You get to such a depth where you realize that, wow, there's so much more. And the unknown is so much greater than the known. And you understand that even those mitzvahs that are rational in your word seemed rational, when you plumb to their depths, you see that there's a great depth that you still don't know, and they become, in a way, like chukim. Thank you.